Yeah, this is the last keynote session, and it will be Tess Watterson and will be chaired by Madeline Stearns. And I leave you in their capable hands for the next hour.
Awesome. I think I see people trickling in, so I feel good about getting going if you guys do. I'll just briefly introduce myself for those of you who, I don't know, yesterday was really early and I was not in my own brain for the most part. My name is Madeline Stearns, and I am a recent master's graduate of art history, and so my background is art history with medieval and early modern subject matter. But I'm currently teaching at the college level, teaching things like film and mythology, and so this content is like really special to me. In terms of like its overlap with art history and everything else. And now I guess it is with my great pleasure actually that we finally get to hear from Tess, who's been with us the last today and yesterday workshopping, who has a really, really great topic for us today. She is an early career researcher who recently received her PhD from the University of Adelaide for a thesis on witchcraft, gender, and persecution in medievalist fantasy video games. Her early work focused on medievalism and militantism in Robin Hood video games, including her Master's of Research thesis completed at Macquarie University. Tess aims to contribute to expanding pedagogical approaches for engaging with the past through experience and play, including her current role as Special Collections and Experiential Learning Coordinator at the Library of the University of South Wales. So Tess, I will chill up here, but you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much. I will add a quick amendment, since having said that bio, that I actually am no longer in that role, that I added on the end of that list as of in the last few weeks, but that's all right. That's on me. I will just see if I can share my screen. Does that look like it's working? Someone give me a thumbs up or something.
Yes,
Great,
it
beautiful,
looks
thank
good.
you. Alrighty, cool. I'm using the desktop app now for the first time. I've usually been using the just in browser, but my internet's been being a little bit fun today, so I'm hoping that it stays solid and we're all good. So hello, I am Tess Watterson. I'm coming to you live from Australia. So before I begin, I'm just going to start with our practice of acknowledgement of country. So I live and work on stolen land. I acknowledge the custodians, the Darug people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I think this is particularly important for the topic that we are addressing here. That which is kind of branded as monstrous or other is often just that which is different from a sort of powerful norm. So discourses of monstrosity and savagery and things of this nature have been sort of instrumental in displacement, invasion, colonialism globally. So it's really crucial that this is always as a fact that we're aware of when thinking about medievalism and its uses. It is such a privilege to be invited to give the keynote paper for Coding Medieval Worlds this year. I've been attending since the first in 2021, and I'll say as I wrote this, excellent planning, James, to have these align with the year numbers. So it's very easy to remember what number we're up to, 2024. But I do want to also take this moment to give another shout out to James and say thank you again for Coding Medieval Worlds. It is just such a special forum and such a great space for the kinds of intellectual and creative discussions that I wish we had more opportunities for. So just a brief moment for everyone to clap alone in their living rooms or with emojis or whatnot, to say thank you again, James, for organizing this every year. And again, with such thoughtfulness and care to kind of fill this space with the kind of talks and the kind of diversity that you do. And I'm also very privileged this year to go last, because I think it gives me the pleasure of trying at least to reflect on some of the various different topics that we've had covered. And I have to say a lot of things that I was really keen to raise in this keynote and to hear from everyone about have been coming up, and I've been able to already discuss a lot with my groups that I've been part of in the last 2 days worth of sessions, and I've heard lots of things that have resonated in the other talks in the panels. So that's been great. Which is why I so broadly kind of titled this Playing with Medievalism and Monstrosity. So I finished my PhD last year, which delved into this topic through the case study of witches in medievalist fantasy computer roleplay games. So my key focus, that'll do. Key focus in that research has always been around the sort of pivotal role of medievalism in all aspects of fantasy games. And I think when we look at topics that sit at such a sort of nexus of different influences, so looking at monsters means monstrosity, but also gender, race, fantasy genre, sometimes horror genre, video game conventions more broadly, it's sort of immensely challenging to fully consider the way that all of these are operating together. And medievalism is sometimes, I think, kind of lost in some of those discussions about gendered representations in games. So I think it's really crucial that historians, medievalists in particular, are pushing to be in those spaces and in that scholarship. As the last 2 days have very much again every year, but again demonstrated, whether a game itself actually kind of claims medievalism or whether it's sort of more subtle. It's so prominent and it's so influential in how these discourses about identity can operate, and such a useful mode of analysis for letting us tap into sort of more depth than we otherwise could. So a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm first going to summarize some of my research about medievalist ludic witches, and then look at the way that medievalism and monstrosity can sort of operate in the computer roleplay games that I study, and thinking really about game systems themselves. So hopefully I'm going to end a little bit more optimistically, because a lot of what I analyzed and get to talk about in a lot of my research is usually very, not negative, but usually look at how this thing was done that I don't love. And I think one thing that I love about coding medieval worlds is we always kind of leave buzzing with all these ideas about what could be, how we could do things differently, how we could contribute to more complex and meaningful uses of history. So hopefully I've been kind of adding a little to my talk as I've been listening to all the kind of wonderful ideas. So we might be able to reflect a bit on that at the end and in question time together. So to begin with my thesis, my research. So I started with a fairly simple question, I thought, which was I wanted to know how games fit into the broader tradition of what I call shorthandedly witch medievalism. So the way that the popular concept of the witch, both as a diabolical worshipper and as a persecution victim, is widely imagined to be a product of the Middle Ages. So this figure of the witch really only coalesced from the 15th century in the sort of transition between our periodization of medieval and early modern. And the rise in persecution really reaches its heights in 16th, 17th centuries across different parts of Europe. Indeed, as I've told my students in some of my history courses, we're closer in time today to the last witch trials in Europe than the people at the start of the early Middle Ages were to the witch trials. So it seemed logical to me that games would be playing a part in this tradition today, given their prominence, more broadly, and how many witches I'd encountered, even just in kind of my own casual play and certainly in my historical research. But again, as many of us are very likely familiar with in other fields, they had never been included in the scholarship about witch representations and beliefs. So the goal there with this question was twofold. It was bring medievalism into other analysis of games and of game witches, and then bring games into witchcraft scholarship. So very interdisciplinary, and that came with its own challenges. I began with a very ambitious goal of offering some kind of historical overview of all witch games ever. But I do have an absurd, ever-growing spreadsheet of that. But of course, I narrowed down from there into first thinking about the significance of fantasy genre texts, because they are so powerful in the construction of this narrative. And then further to think of 3 case studies that felt significant in the genre there, which is Skyrim, and how it fits into the Elder Scrolls series, but more specifically looking at Skyrim, the Witcher series and the Dragon Age series. And yes, in part, this was because I couldn't get 2 sentences into a conversation about my topic without being asked, oh, like The Witcher? And it got a lot easier once I could just say yes. But I'll just pause briefly to add a quick kind of content warning of sorts. Relative to other talks I've done, this is, I think, pretty chill but I do use some strong language around kind of monstrous or grotesque in quoting some of the game text, especially towards the end of my talk. And I will discuss video game violence, especially gendered violence. So if you feel the need to disconnect at any time, please do so. There's not very many images in my slides. I've started to try and minimize how much I'm just sort of rebroadcasting sensationalized gendered violence from modern games. So there's not actually very many at all, but just if that's something to be aware of, just making sure people know that going forward. So in these fantasy worlds that I was looking at in my thesis, witch is one of many types of magic user that is specifically delineated by the game system. So my analysis was focusing on how the characters and the beings that were labeled as witches were constructed and situated in their game worlds. So in some cases, the sort of absence of the term witch is just as significant as its application in terms of things that are drawing on that tradition and using those ideas, but still not labeling them as witches. So I was interested in what was actually kind of tangibly directly connected to this idea by the game designers themselves. I used the game text, so play as research, and as well as published paratext, so looking at especially game guides, kind of world building material that was seeking to explain these beings and this sort of in-world history. And as a point of clarification as well, before I continue, I talk about the witches here as women. I use she, her pronouns. That is purely because the witches that I examine in these case studies are explicitly associated with femininity. I'd be happy to talk more about the kind of nuances of this historically and in terms of modern witches, modern practices of witchcraft. The developers here are definitely kind of taking up the idea of the witch as a specifically feminine identity, and so that's why I'm referring to this as women, or as kind of her story, as it were, in this specific case. And same goes for gender. If I at any point, in especially ad-libbing, mention a choice between sort of two genders, it's very much because the games are framing it in that way and are giving us these options, these particular texts of the two genders, and it's certainly not my own sort of beliefs about gender diversity. So the other speakers of the workshop this weekend have already demonstrated, I think, many, many different ways that monsters are expressions of anxieties, are reflections of fears and concerns of whatever given culture is kind of producing those narratives. Just as in all imaginings of the witch, then all the witchcraft narratives in these games are different expressions of anxieties about minority and alterity and power. And here it's what I found most common is women building agentic power outside of the control of institutional authority. So magic in these worlds has become something to kind of regulate and control in particular ways. And the witch narratives are put to work in kind of explaining that and detailing that for the player. The witches are monstrous and are kind of outsiders. And so the power of the witch is always subjugated or mediated then by a broader force within the game. So whether that's the in-game cultural forces, so institutions of magical learning usually, or kind of city guard, city watch type magic police, or by the superior power of the heroic player character or player character's party. These checks on her power ensure that she does not overpower the traditional fantasy hero or system, and so that the female fantasy witch can kind of simultaneously be powerful, even seen as empowering, but implicitly never actually truly threatening. So this is one of the key arguments I ended up exploring. The way that the narrative power of the witch is then incorporated into a game system consistently disqualifies any sort of potential disruptive power that her monstrosity could hold. The historical resonance of the witch and the deliberate arrangement of archetypal features enabled the games to simultaneously sort of appear kind of nuanced and interesting in certain ways, but really still engage with misogynistic kind of reductive tropes. The witch is not represented in these games for engagement with her narrative itself, but instead is used, as I said, as a kind of tool in service of the rest of the game. So concepts of witch medievalism operate as a historical referent to produce a sense of medievalist authenticity to the gamescapes and the in-game cultures, and as a tool to convey meanings about norms and others in this culture. And that's what I want to focus more on today. So when I think about medievalism, monstrosity, and marginality as a concept together, as others have mentioned already, and as I think many of, especially the historians, might also bring to mind, I think about monsters in the margins, kind of literally medieval manuscripts, medieval maps, and the use of monsters to occupy unknown space. So I'm generalizing, obviously, but medieval people sort of filled the spaces around and in between with often truly bizarre illustrations of all sorts of creatures and beings, often kind of monstrous hybrid inventions that were filling these unknown spaces, these sort of uncharted areas, to suggest unknown dangers. So they weren't necessarily to be taken literally, but were warnings, kind of metaphorical, often conjured based on tales of explorers using kind of past works, so Ptolemy's writings and maps, very common. But this use of monsters is very contextual. It's serving a role. It's representing a sort of belief. These monsters don't necessarily retain their power in being monstrous if they're removed from context. So if you just see the image of this monster by itself, you don't necessarily know the purpose that it was serving and the kind of meanings of its unknowability and its strangeness to represent this kind of idea of something being uncharted and unknown, and so therefore potentially some dangerous. They might still be seen as grotesque or kind of scary if they still correspond with the new contexts, fears and values in that way anyway, but they aren't necessarily actually monstrous and serving the same kind of purpose. Some of this has been explored very much by other speakers, and Rebecca in our first panel yesterday really summarized considerations of monstrosity and difference, monsters as cultural signifiers of Cohen's monster theory really excellently. So thank you for that. And I won't focus too much on explaining that here, but I'm going to come back to this argument about what constitutes monstrosity shortly. Throughout medievalist traditions, ideas of the monstrous operate as this expression of their creators' fears, so specifically through the construction of the past. To give one example, but there is a whole range of excellent scholarship in this area. Serena Patterson has analysed 17th century reimaginings of medievalized monsters, demonstrating the central role that they played in how early modern people, quote, constructed their modernity in terms of the past. So Patterson notes how these reimagined medieval figures, quote, inhabit a commonplace space in the early modern imagination by negotiating the junction between the historically distant and the domestically familiar. She argues that they interpreted a medieval landscape for the purposes of cultural commodification, reworking medieval motifs for popular culture, and that the convergence of 17th century popular monster culture with the ideas of the medieval forms quintessentially conflations and juxtapositions that tell us much more about the Renaissance mind, and more specifically, they create a sense of the past through their monsters. So what I liked about this was first of thinking, the reason I quote this particular article is thinking about how common and how relatable these ideas are. If you reframed and talked about 21st century popular culture, you could use almost the exact same kind of phrasing. So thinking about how these are very long-running traditions, that 17th century creations, and thinking about monsters and medieval monsters in particular often operate in very similar ways in different contexts. The witch in popular imagination is this quintessential monstrous medieval. So enchanted and enchanting, barbarous and unrestrained, either as a monstrous other herself, in this context herself, as a diabolical kind of devil worshipper, or as symbolic of the monstrous nature of violent and fanatical persecution. I really like the way that Alexander Doty and Patricia Clare Ingham conceptualized the medieval witch in their 2014 analysis of the 1922 Swedish-Danish silent film Hags, which is Witchcraft Through the Ages, is the English title. So they argue that the witch's tradition is fundamentally shaped by the juncture of medievalism and monstrosity, and that, quote, the figure of the witch regularly crosses boundaries, temporal and narrative, or confuses categories, epistemological and cognitive. I'm going to include this longer quote, and I will read it because I think it's really helpful for thinking about what kind of constitutes a monster in this sense, and how games might kind of challenge that. So her continuous existence over centuries also offers access to an interesting subcategory of medievalism. If, as Mittman also compellingly puts it, the monster is known through its effect, its impact, then the witch, bedeviling to influential thinkers for centuries, seems emblematic of a certain kind of distributive monstrous effect. Unlike many of the other categories of monster, whose aspect and threat proliferate in particular times and spaces, the figure of the witch confuses repeatedly, at diverse historical moments, although in strangely familiar ways. This monstrous witch stops change, not dead but living, in its tracks. A monster documented but not realized, photographed but never captured. The witch is named and renamed but never named securely. And I think if we kind of hold this understanding of monstrosity, so something that is frightening or horrifying because it cannot in itself be fully known through the normative systems of understanding, or as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen kind of famously argues, monstrosity operating as a, quote, abjecting epistemological device, thinking then as well as just Julia Kristeva's kind of abject as the reaction to something that threatens our ability to classify subject and object. So drawing on Kristeva, Sarah Stang in game studies argues that the abject disturbs identity, threatens the borders that we have established between human and animal, culture and nature, self and other. So if we hold this understanding of the monstrous, then a lot of what video games and especially fantasy texts labels superficially as a monster doesn't really fit, doesn't really hold up. Texts that apply the concept of a monster as a fixed identity, as a classification, can't account for the way that culture and meaning, that human feelings and interaction and reaction is not fixed. It changes in response to the world around it. Something stops being monstrous when it is understood, when it is incorporated into the epistemology of a culture. So now, when we were discussing in our group yesterday, for example, non-violent ways of encountering the monstrous in games, Sven gave a really interesting example of the Wendigo and indigenous stories that have a monstrosity that is healed, that is kind of brought back into a community. And my instinctive response, I think, because of the type of text that I have worked on and the way that they frame monstrosity, was to think, well, I can see how that would work in that context, but if we did that here, it's just as violent. It's an erasure or a removal of difference. In a sense, it's almost colonizing to have your response to difference be to adapt it into your system, right? That's the only way to resolve the conflict of difference. So I lay awake when I should have been asleep this morning, kind of thinking more about this and how it's such a reflection of the way that my brain has been trained by these games, especially, but lots of popular culture, to think about monstrosity as a kind of permanent identity fixture, as something inherent to a being and therefore inherent to a society, as something quite fixed. When what we actually mean when we say that something could become no longer monstrous, could be healed, is it's not always that it's sort of changing that being or that monster. It's that we're changing the worldview. We're shifting and kind of expanding to accept new elements and new understandings as part of what can be considered the norm. I think as outsiders, so particularly for me, I think about, in terms of my own identity, sort of queerness or being fat, we have this really deep attachment to the monstrous because seeing representations of the non-normative is really important, especially for minority identities. And so often what the norm deems monstrous, not inherently threatening, actually only threatening to the kind of particular way of being and knowing that minority identities are often excluded from or seen as kind of threatening to, but not actually in itself being kind of violently threatening. And so what I want to talk a little more about with witches today, and I hope this isn't too garbled at 4:30 in the morning, as I've been sort of pondering these ideas in the last 2 days, is revisiting the idea that James suggested as a possible topic for discussion, which we didn't really directly get to, but I think the other groups probably also touched on in some ways, which is this idea of the monstrous being normalized, the half-orc running the tavern, right? Is this monstrous still? I would argue no. I think that they're no longer in conflict with the norm. So I think it's all about this sort of perspective, about the assumption that a society or a culture can only have one worldview, which is problem in itself, right? Something we often oversimplify for video games, where, if you travel to a certain part of the map, they're going to believe X, they're going to sell X resource, speak X language, sort of have this set of shorthand ways of understanding different communities in order to sort of group them together and make that accessible, especially big sort of civilization type games. I think that makes it quite hard to achieve any actual sort of diversity on a broader scale in a lot of ways in games. Before I get on too much of a tangent about the meaning of life, though, I will bring myself back to the sort of key point that I want to consider in more depth, right, which is the way that game systems categorize this need to sort of label and identify the different aspects of a world to be able to interact with it. I mean, we literally titled this workshop, right, Coding Medieval Worlds. So the way they codify the world into a system that can be read by a computer, in this case, I'm talking about computer games, into rules that can be specifically kind of structured and upheld. And this holds a real tension immediately for what we can actually do to explore cultural specificity and notions of monstrosity that really, to achieve kind of interesting depth with that, need to be flexible, need to be changeable, need to be able to react to changing perspective and worldview of what is actually monstrous and what is actually the norm. So if we think of witches, I think, are the perfect exemplification of this. So CRPGs have an explicitly delineated system of their characterizations. If we think of Dottie and Ingham's kind of eloquently phrased concept that the monstrosity of the witch lies in how the witch is never named securely, then the power of the witch really as a monster relies on there being no security or certainty about what she is or what she can do. But video game systems aren't designed to accommodate this kind of key factor of monstrosity. It doesn't mean they can't, certainly, and that's something I'm very keen to discuss more. But it's in the games that I've been looking at and in these kind of big AAA roleplay games, they aren't designed for that. They aren't built with that in mind. So if you think of the monster, according to Cohen, as, quote, best understood as an embodiment of difference, a breaker of category, a resistant other known only through processes and movement, never through dissection, table analysis. Through Kristeva's suggestion, the abject is distinguishable from the object because the object is definable, but the abject is, quote, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. As Mittman ascribes the kind of power of the monster, right, to how it defies human power to subjugate through categorization, as Rebecca explored yesterday as well in her paper of the panel, this idea of understanding the monster through impact as opposed to trying to look at what it is in itself. These conceptualizations of monstrosity do not work for my CRPG monsters that I was analyzing. They are, by their very nature, dissectable, unambiguous to the player who is literally equipped with their stat block. And here is drawing on Svelch's kind of argument that video games produce a new form of monstrosity due to their nature as interactive and, more importantly, as rule-based systems. So explaining that, quote, the traditional conceptualizations of monstrosities saw monsters as strange and unfathomable, as epistemological challenges. However, in games, even boss enemies that can have somewhat of a unique arrangement of the potential abilities and stats of the game world, they're still going to follow this logic of informatic control. Right, so the player still learns their design through interactions, learns how to defeat or win against them in this part of the game. So this new monstrosity is knowable and unambiguous. And Svelch drawing on Wolfgang Iser's literary theory of indeterminacy. So this is a quote from the article and not from Iser, just to clarify, that the reader concretizes an image of a fictional world based on the clues she is given in the text. The image is, however, perpetually incomplete. This indeterminacy allows for a blurred and contradictory portrayal of monstrosity. But that is what is only possible to a small degree in a text like these computer roleplay games. So the witch cannot completely lurk in the shadows, especially not in games where uncovering bestiary entries for different types of monsters becomes an achievement mechanism, literally in itself. Collecting extensive lore, both in-game and in paratext, is an element of the game's appeal. There is a tension between this traditional conceptualization of monstrosity as abject and the way that these monsters are catalogued by the game system. And this tension is very evident in the dissonance between the narrative or visual representations, which can maintain these sort of elements of abjection in some ways, and the mechanical game structure that requires a sort of processable data. So looking at some examples now from the games that I studied. So the monstrous hags in the Witcher games and Skyrim in particular are focused on, so the devourers, water hags and grave hags in the Witcher games and the hag ravens in Skyrim. They are narratively shrouded in mystery. They're framed as these sort of mysterious and terrifying creatures. They're then mechanically reduced to data in the same sort of key systems through which all the creatures and NPCs in the game are also known. They're represented in a bestiary in the same sort of way. So as much as you can see in my screenshot on the slide at the moment, Geralt can say, I can't say exactly what they are. I don't know exactly how to understand them, but they're very dangerous. You can then immediately open up the bestiary entry and check things like, which oil should I use to most effectively harm them? And they're fit into immediately one of the different types of categories of monster. So in these sort of conventional structures as well, they're always going to be read by the player as enemies first and foremost. Something like The Witcher divides its journal into bestiary and character catalogs, so you have separate sections as well, and occasionally you do see humanoid kind of creatures and monstrous creatures crossing those boundaries in different ways, but it very much is to do with how you're expected to interact with them as enemy or not. So the narrative depictions are kind of set dressing effectively for the sort of performance of these mechanical expectations. Game systems have to be able to convert this narrative idea into this processable set of data points, so that gives us things like health score, the types of attack they might use, the type of attack they're vulnerable to, and the sort of interactable objects that they leave behind on their death. They're also assigned a level, which represents how challenging combat enemy is rendered by these stats and how advanced the player should be in their own level progression before engaging with them. Either in-game or in paratext, both The Witcher and Elder Scrolls offer this information to the player in mathematical, quantitative descriptions of the stats of the NPCs or the monsters. So in Skyrim, the stats for creatures and NPCs are mechanically delineated between humanoid witches and hags and the creature hag ravens in a number of ways. And it allows them to be kind of understood and compared with other monsters. So this is probably way too many numbers to be effectively processed by most of our brains on a Sunday afternoon. But just to kind of take a little subset of some of these examples to compare, the witch, the hag, and the hag raven have static stats as enemies. So regardless of the player's level, the witch is going to be level 4, hags will be level 8, and then hag ravens will be level 20. Other types of magic users, so most NPC types actually advance through a range of different levels with differing stats to correspond to the player's own level at the time of encounter. So they scale. And that makes those encounters kind of interesting no matter what stage of the game you encounter them. Characters and creatures have a stat called Magicka, which is the numerical value that represents their reserve of magical power used to cast spells. The hag at level 8 has 96 Magicka, which is less than the lowest level novice mages in any of the other categories of mage. There's 5 fire, ice, storm mages, and then conjurers and necromancers. They all begin at 100 Magicka at the lowest level. These other mages also scale up. They go up to the highest level of 46 for them, which is 500 Magicka. Even if the hag becomes a hag raven, which is this narratively very kind of dramatic and significant transformation into this terrifying creature, she's set at level 20 with 315 Magicka. And that's as strong as she can get. There's no advancement. There's no change there. So the witch NPCs are relatively weak even for their fixed level, and that's what these sort of numbers are some examples of some of the other relative types of magic users and the Magicka levels that they have. So they're rendered very easy combat enemies. Mechanically, especially if the player is at a higher level, but even lower levels, Other types of mage have the ability to become more powerful and seem more threatening because of how their abilities scale. This feels very jarring for the witches and the hagravens in particular against this narrative construction of their monstrosity and kind of fear-inducing identities. So in the in-game book Herbane's Bestiary about hagravens, there's a very thorough kind of description of hagravens, a very emphatic characterization of them as creatures, as no longer humanoid. There are 3 bestiary books in this series that you can kind of find throughout the game world that you can collect. There are 2 entirely non-human subjects, which are the ice wraiths and the automatons, which are robots. So it situates immediately the hagraven among these very non-human type creatures. And then the text describes the confluence of a young woman vanishing to the Reach with subsequent increased sightings of witches, of kind of half woman, half bird, and kind of tells the story of how the author encounters and kills a hagraven. The author describes the approach to the lair, quote, with sword and shield at the ready, for I must see this creature and I must slay it. The text depicts the lair decorated with death and decay, so various different symbols, blood, kind of skeletons, and then, quote, the unsteady shuffling followed by a heaving, unforgettable stench of the approaching hagraven, who he then fights. And he describes the hagraven as horrifying, as you can see on the left page in the screenshot, horrifying, almost human, but more an abomination of woman and creature fused together. Nothing more than a husk of humanity surrendered in exchange for possession of the powers of dark magic. This description repeatedly emphasizes she was once a human woman, as a means of kind of enhancing the horror of this new form. By comparison, the other 2 Herbane texts follow a very similar structure. So an encounter ending with the author claiming his great feat against this monster, right? It's very impressive, beyond the normal abilities of man. But the descriptions of the ice wraiths and the automatons use far less emotive or moralizing language. While the hagravens are vile and horrifying and corrupted, contorted, repulsive, foul, ice wraiths are ethereal and deadly and savage. The automatons are described with almost no such language at all. It's with phrases like inhuman strength and great fortitude, but that's about all you get. And even the kind of also a comment that, quote, I could not help but marvel at these single-purpose machines. So these are both singularly dangerous enemies in the game mechanics, and they are slightly more, but fairly comparable to the hagravens in terms of the mechanics and the challenge that they offer. But they receive a very different treatment in terms of this narrative description, because they do not inspire horror through a kind of false resemblance to humanity. And Herbane even kind of writes that hagravens deserve the fate of death as a sort of very dramatic ending. And the other 2 stories don't have that phrasing. So we have this narrative emphasis on the hagraven's monstrous power versus their mechanical limitations in the game that positions them as relatively sort of minor enemies. I would also note, whether this is intentional or not, the witch is actually the only NPC's category that is listed in the game guide as specifically all female, while there are other subtypes of various classes that are kind of restricted to certain genders within a broader type. And there are individual kind of powerful female magic users amongst some other categories, for sure, but it is only the underpowered witch that is exclusively female. But that's kind of a bigger issue that we can discuss further if we want to, but just of note. The other example, kind of component that I want to discuss as I finish up is the way that looting mechanics specifically kind of negate a lot of these ideas about monstrosity. So the looting of enemy corpses, almost ubiquitous concept in RPGs, particularly in fantasy games that have alchemical practices or personalized equipment, which, these materials are collected and used for. Enemy corpses provide a key repository for items that are needed for improving your character, often for specific quests. But the narrative process of searching a corpse, right, is designed to offer a sort of sense of interactivity beyond simply like collecting discarded items, say from the site of an enemy death, without kind of accessing and approaching the corpse in this way that we've sort of very much normalized in the gamescape. Looting is a way to kind of reward the player for succeeding in the encounter. Often the items that are gained do give mechanical or narrative insights, even if they hold no other value in the system apart from maybe to sell or gain profit. The type of items that a corpse holds reflects that creature's categorization in the game system. So usually humanoid corpses can be looted for the objects that they're carrying, and then creature corpses can be looted for their actual body parts as well. So in The Witcher, certain body parts of notable enemy monsters can also be taken as trophies that give mechanical benefits if they're worn on Geralt's horse as a prize. These are often deeply kind of reinforcing the game's categorizations as well. So they give particular bonuses, 5% more damage against human enemies or particular types of enemies. The real violence of corpse looting and trophy taking is entirely removed from looting in these systems. If you're interested in this more in general, I would suggest Andrew Reinhardt's book on archaeogaming really has a kind of interesting discussion of this. So Reinhardt attributes the popularization of looting corpses in games to Dungeons and Dragons. And obviously many games have utilized similar mechanics without the term loot. But Reinhardt's really interested in the way that ethical archaeological implications are normalized by kind of looting in games. Players are expected to view fallen enemies as resource opportunities, and many quests kind of require corpse looting as well. In both The Witcher and Skyrim, monstrous witches' corpses can be looted for the removal of these body parts in this way. So teeth, claws, extraction of substances like venom, or in The Witcher, as you can see on the screen, mutagens. After killing humanoid enemies, such as bandits, in either game, the player can only take objects like their armor, their swords, their belongings. They can't interact with their actual body, but after killing the monsters, you can remove these elements of their being to utilize in alchemy, to consume, or to sell. Again, very standardized, but if we sort of stop and think about what this means, very problematic and concerning as a kind of mechanic, right? So it's the complete reduction of their physical body and any possessions to anonymous bodily specimens, defining them by their sort of nature as a creature as opposed to any potential individuality they could have. When looting devourers, for example, in The Witcher, the player can collect teeth. In The Witcher 3, water hags yield a monster tongue, monster saliva, venom extract, water essence, and then uniquely the water hag mutagen or water hag tooth. Once you collect these, they all become kind of anonymously labeled, stacked items in your inventory. Even if you collect them from a kind of named or known being, they don't stay kind of separated in that way. To further reinforce this, as well as a distinction between the human and monstrous witches, the kind of different types of characters, these hag characters, body parts of monstrous witches are requested in the form of paid Witcher contracts. And so there is actually an example in the fourth chapter of The Witcher, in the first Witcher game, where a human local witch in a place called Murky Waters has a contract on the notice board for 10 sets of devourer teeth. So the kind of human witch literally is requesting through this kind of contract the violence against one of the monstrous witches. The hags then are rendered also entertainingly conquerable by the game, in part because of the sort of visual and narrative elements of the historical witch no longer hold that same monstrous power when they're removed from historical context. So by recontextualizing these elements in a fantasy landscape, we end up with this very seemingly kind of absurd and exaggerated figures, especially like the devourers, which die, I think I mentioned yesterday in one of the groups, a very kind of dramatic and silly looking, kind of comical looking death when you fight them. Because it's this very surface level pastiche remediation, I guess, that is enabled by this widespread popularity of the witch archetype and of other bricolage medievalisms that add up into these texts, and the normalization of these types of modes of violence and conquest. the games encourage the players to think of monsters as a sort of assemblage of body parts that can be dissected and kind of collected, utilized, practices that take on further meanings when they're combined with the deeply gendered nature of the witch archetype, but taken out of a context where that deeply gendered representation reflects specific cultural concerns. We can kind of align those in particular ways with what was happening in the early modern period. But if we take it away from that context, they no longer hold the same meanings. And this is significant because it literally is, as I mentioned earlier, dissection table analysis, right? Cohen's argument that monsters can't be understood in this way, or it negates their monstrosity. So this sort of fantasy game not only lets you dissect and analyze, actually sometimes it even begins from an assumption that you already know. You aren't killing at something for the first time, dissecting and understanding it. You already know that those parts can be used in potions. You're killing devourers because you're going to be paid to collect their teeth and kind of give them to someone to use in a potion. The meanings are already implied to be known and understood. They're already not monstrous in that sense. So in my research, I was really largely looking at how the potential of witches as medievalist monsters could theoretically unsettle boundaries and challenge norms, but how in these games that is very specifically negated by these game system issues. But what I've loved in the last 2 days, and I'm finishing up now, I promise, is talking about the possibilities, the ways that we could represent medieval monsters through games to seek interaction and engagement that doesn't just categorize and conquer. And I think there's a lot of different ways that this can happen, and we talked about a lot of them, so I won't go into much detail because I want to get to questions and discussion in our group. So if you read through some of the notes in the Google Doc about some of these ideas too, we talked about various ways that different kind of game modes might be able to let players encounter and know things in different ways that don't necessitate violence. I also think, and one example that's come up a few times at the conference so far already has been Plague's Tale. The rats in Plague's Tale, I think, are a really good example of the way that a game can focus its metaphorical energy more specifically through a particular type of monster or being, instead of this very kind of openly populated open world view that ends up reducing and minimizing a lot of what the monsters can mean. Instead, we see ways that we can still carry kind of metaphor and implication. So the way that the rats, these kind of hordes of rats, represent the spread of plague as a kind of metaphor, and then can still operate as a literal kind of combat monster in a lot of ways. It doesn't kind of negate that. So I think, I actually think that I will wrap up because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that I don't just keep rambling on through ideas too much. I'd much rather hear kind of all of yours. But what I want to look at next and what I want to talk with you about is, the potential, the different ways that we can do this in more interesting ways if we take these ideas into account. So I'll finish there.
Yeah, I mean, I have that we have, maybe about 10 minutes if you would like. But otherwise, if you would like to move to questions. I think that sounds...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think jump in if that's all right. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I definitely want to invite, more of a comment than a question. Comments, please jump in and share ideas as well while we have this discussion.